and I'm just going to quickly introduce the three panelists as soon as I find out what happened with my my notes. Somebody grabbed them by mistake. There it is right there. Added to the panel now, we have Jared Ho from the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Jared's right here. Jay Kramer, who's lacking a tent card so far. He's a supervisory special agent from, there you go, David. You can have the seat there, and there's your tent card. He's a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in New York City. And on the end here, to my left, is Bill Hoffman with the World Economic Forum. Again, the bios are in the materials that were handed out when you checked in today. So what we agreed to do, since two of our panelists got to speak at some length, is that the three new people joining the panel are going to take about 60 to 90 seconds. We'll probably give you the hook at 2 minutes to kind of give just a brief overview of what it is you do and what your interests are in this area. So let's just take it from the end here. Let's start with Bill and work our way down.
Great. Thanks, Brooks.
Oh, I forgot something important. Please welcome our panel.
Hi, my name is Bill Hoffman. I work at the World Economic Forum, where I lead a global initiative on what's called data-driven development. And it's generally a focus on how the use of data, big, small, personal, aggregate, whatever, can be used in a more trusted and accountable fashion to serve the global good. Absent all that buzzwords, what we're trying to do is to really focus the use of data analytics for emerging markets. And from a problem statement, if there's a quote-unquote data deluge in the global north, in many areas in the global south, if you cut the world in half, there's a lack of data. There's a number of gaps in terms of the quality of the data, the ability to identify many individuals, and just simply the lack of connection between public sector and private sector data. So at one level, the work that we're doing is trying to make the trustworthy flow of data of different types and the quality of data to improve so that the policies, the decisions, the rights of individuals, if you will, the digital ecology can strengthen. The second track that we're working on is around the governance. This is a whole new space with a whole new array of harms, a whole new way of possibilities, and so the ethics, the governance, and just understanding what are the intentions of using the data need to be more clearly understood, and so that's another area that we're working on. And lastly, it was touched on earlier by Kaz, to be human-centered and to really focus on the design principles and, quite frankly, to get those in power, those with access to the tools, the technology, us, out of the way, and to go into the communities, to listen, to understand with a more empathic way of what are the needs, and then how can we genuinely empower individuals to use the data to create the services that are wanted. So along with the utility or the impact you get from big data, we're really focusing on making sure it has utility.
Thank you, Bill. Jared.
Hi. First off, the necessary disclosure that the views expressed today are purely my own and not necessarily those of the Commission. I'm an attorney in the Federal Trade Commission's Office of.
Get a little closer to the mic.
I'm an attorney in in the Federal Trade Commission's Office of Technology Research and Investigations. If you haven't heard of our group before, it's because we recently rebranded from we were formerly known as the Mobile Technology Unit, and our rebrand was partially in recognition that new and innovative technologies have expanded beyond purely just mobile. So our office interfaces with, is based in the Bureau of Consumer Protection, and we interface with the various divisions within our bureau, litigating divisions in our bureau, to offer internal guidance and support and research with respect to new and innovative technologies. Externally, we conduct independent research to and offer best practices for consumers, businesses, and policymakers in the consumer payments space. A couple years ago, we held a workshop on mobile payments, and most recently, we issued a report on consumer protection issues surrounding shopping apps. That is, apps that offer consumers the ability to make purchases at brick and mortar stores through their mobile device, redeem coupons, or compare prices. So with that, thank you.
Good, thank you. And finally, Jay.
Okay, thank you for having me here. My name is Jay Kramer. I'm an attorney by trade, although I'm currently serving as one of the FBI's supervisory special agents in our cyber division in our New York office, where we have 6 cyber groups of agents and analysts that are addressing violations of criminal law and threats to national security. This is an increasingly complex area of operations for us, and as you may know, the FBI is not only a law enforcement agency, we're also a member of the U.S. intelligence community. So increasingly, we're sharing information, and all of the issues discussed today are relevant to our practice on a day-to-day basis. Access to information, encryption, technology, mobile data, big data, they're all relevant to our mission, which we're plussing up to address.
Thank you. So as you can see, we're crowded down here, so I'm going to stand up, and hopefully the panel doesn't feel like I'm behind them throwing spitballs at them. Now, David's prepared remarks were approved by Treasury, but I believe you need to make a disclaimer for any comments you make at the panel.
And I'll join Jared's disclaimer about the views presented being mine. Thank you.
Fortunately, in DC, we're used to this when we do these kinds of events. So I'd like to start out with, actually with privacy. I know I kicked this off a while ago with tales of woe on security, but and for this, I'd like to use a kind of a hypothetical example. So let's say I happen to be a Verizon Wireless customer for mobile. Let's say I go on my cell phone and I do a Google search for a product, and I find it at Amazon.com, so I move from Google to Amazon. And then from Amazon, I see the product is $1,500. I want to check my bank account and make sure I have enough money in my bank account to make that purchase. So I go to my bank's website, and then I decide, oh, I can afford that. So then I make the purchase using Visa, and they get involved in the transaction. And then let's just throw another wrinkle in it. Let's say I'm in California at the time. So with that kind of a transaction, you have, for each of those entities, you potentially have a different set of privacy rules for each of them. And you potentially have, I can think of at least 3 and potentially more sets of regulations, particularly in California, which has its own state regulations. So I'm going to throw this to Jared first at the FTC, because now you do a lot of privacy regulation, and you would like to talk a lot about, well, what is the consumer expectation when they're going online and they're making a transaction? So the question is, what is the consumer expectation? How can a consumer have a reasonable expectation when you've got, in a single transaction, like my hypothetical, potentially 5 different sets of privacy rules? Does that make sense? Do we need a new way to approach this? How would you answer that? And then we'll go down the line.
Okay, that has multiple parts, and I'm going to pivot slightly.
I started with it.
First off, it might help to sort of give a general overview of the Federal Trade Commission's jurisdiction. So our primary authority is Section 5 of the FTC Act, and that gives us jurisdiction over basically any business in or affecting commerce. That's very broad jurisdiction, and specifically our act prohibits unfair or deceptive acts. So you might think of deception as a claim that ends up not being true. On the unfairness side, there has to be substantial injury to a consumer, and that injury must not be outweighed by countervailing benefits to consumers, and the injury can't be something that's reasonably avoidable by those consumers. So those are sort of like the 2 frameworks that the FTC operates under. With respect to mobile payment transactions, Brooks is absolutely right. There's a multitude of players out there. In any given transaction, you might have various participants that touch on different agencies' jurisdictions. So on the FTC side, you might see FTC jurisdiction being implicated when we're talking about the device manufacturer, the person that created the physical product that you're using to execute your payment. It also includes the operating system, so the stuff that's working behind the scenes to make this phone work. On top of that, you might be talking about specific application providers, and those are sort of like the different touch points where the FTC jurisdiction comes into play. Now, I'm probably less qualified to discuss the jurisdiction of the other agencies that come into play, but one caveat is that the Section 5 does have a carve-out for common carriers. So to the extent that a carrier is acting, is engaging in its own sort of like carrier-type activities, FTC jurisdiction wouldn't apply in that case. Similarly, there's different carve-outs for banks as well.
Bill, do you have a kind of a more world perspective? Is the U.S. just crazy to have such a patchwork? Should we be looking at some other part of the world for a model for our privacy protections?
In front of the FBI and the FTC, I'm not going to take that one. Here's what I'll offer. I think, to a degree, if we name those front door entities, that makes a kind of tractable problem. But if you look behind the scenes at the highly complex, constantly changing supply chain of who else would touch the data, I mean, just simply on the browser, there's probably 20 different ad trackers, right? So beginning to answer the question, who has your data, what were they doing that, and was that legally compliant? I think that's the first problem, is we can't audit and enforce. And so from a supply chain risk dimension, I think that's the challenge. And then once that becomes more, I'll call it rigorously audited and enforceable, then we can start to have meaningful conversations. But right now, it's, I think, nearly an impossible question to say, yes, a harm was done and this was the entity that was liable, because it could be 5 guys down in Austin, Texas, that had access to enormous amounts of data that simply nobody can find. So that would, and I would say that extends globally around the world too, is we have a highly, highly complex information flows that there are lack of commercial incentives to really start to drive and be able to audit.
Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
I was just going...
For those of you who just joined us, it's important we use the mic because they're streaming it and also recording it.
Okay. I was just going to add that at the FBI, the default is we like to rely on process, criminal process, judicial process, whenever possible, to remove any question as to the propriety of the collection of data to support our investigations. And unfortunately, sometimes the speed with which we can get that process varies depending on the carriers, the type of information. So we also rely on consent often. And the rules do vary depending on the type of data and where it's coming from. But we are mindful of not overstepping voluntary or permissive sharing with us. And that becomes more complex with our investigations that are increasingly international in the cyber arena. So European privacy laws differ from US privacy laws, retention, the length of time data is retained. So it's a challenge for all of us.
I'll say. Anybody else want to touch it, Louis or David? You don't have to. We can come back to you. You've got you can use the lavalier in front of you, Louis. The little,
right.
the one on the cord. There you go.
Thank you, Brooks. There are a couple of principles that we profess as being central to privacy, that the customer owns the data, informed consent. I think the issue that you raise shows just how much of a nonsense we've made in practice of those principles. As consumers, we lost. In the legal complexity, we have no clue what's happening. And we're unfortunately facing this increasingly complex world. I can just tell you we're working on one project at the moment in Australia, just mapping the use of terminology across the access laws, some of which use data, some of which use information, others use documents, and every term is defined differently in acts that are supposed to interact with one another, and we need to figure out who's got access to what. So this goes down to the DNA of the structure that's developed. And I really think it needs serious attention before this grows any further, or we need to rethink our basic premises around privacy. Not to ditch it, but to rethink and reshape it for the world that's developing.
Thank you. So we're going to run out of time before we get started here with our late start. So we hit at least two of our topics. I want to switch to security now, and we'll start with Jay on this one. We've all, I think most of us, most of even consumers are familiar with the Home Depot security breach, the Target security breach. I think I heard at the last conference I was at about a week ago, something like over 700 breaches within the last year. And of course, this morning we heard over half the fraud in the counterfeit card fraud in the world is in the U.S., which accounts for about, I think, $5 or $6 billion a year. So it's a huge problem. And then, of course, then you have something like the Sony hack. And some people, certainly most people in this room, are aware of the skimming problem. So what can we do? What can law enforcement do? What can we do in the industry to ensure that consumers feel safe enough to be able to use, not only the new products and services that are coming out, but the existing ones? I've stopped using my credit card at gas pumps, and that's a sad comment, I think. Jay?
Well, we can address the credit card issue separately, because there are some advisors who say it's better to use your credit card as opposed to a personal debit card linked to your account.
Oh, no, I use cash.
Oh, there we go. Good old cash. All right.
I know you forgot that existed.
Right. So to your question about what can the consumer do, it's a struggle for consumers, and to devote the time to becoming more well-read or educated on the issues is the key. And within the whole of government, in addition to the FBI, we're trying to do a lot more outreach, both in a number of forums, because these incidents are going to continue to grow. And one of our primary goals is to make the public and the business community understand that the intrusions that we see are not anomalous. It's not so much if you'll be the victim of some kind of untoward activity. It's when and how quickly you're going to respond, and how quickly you can remediate your system and get back online. And it's going to take some time to change the mindset in that way. I think most people consider themselves lucky when something doesn't happen to them. You read about it and you say, wow, I'm glad that's not me. But the mindset does have to shift. There's a tension between the way the internet evolved as kind of an open means of communication and security. They don't coincide very well. So if we knew how pervasive the use of the internet would become, I think the architects would maybe design it differently. But it's something that everyone has to take a role in.
David, since you're not speaking for Treasury, I'm going to ask you to speak for the Federal Reserve. Are you familiar with, they've done a couple of surveys of mobile banking and mobile payments of consumers. Have you read those? I assume you have.
Yeah, most certainly.
Okay, so
yeah.
one of the big issues, actually, like 30 or 40% of people, one of their concerns is security. So if you want to build on what Jay said and my question in light of those surveys, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think a lot of the work we do looks at the adoption of new payment technologies, of course, for financial inclusion purposes, but others. And resistance, one of the highest resistance factors for adopting new technologies is the security factor. So even when you have very well-established technologies that are having all these issues, it's hard to get people to adopt new ones. And it's ironic in the face of certain new technologies, example, Apple Pay uses very sophisticated tokenization technology, which is much more sophisticated than any plain old magstripe credit card or debit card that you have out there. But people are hesitant to use any type of new technology right now in a lot of ways because they're worried about their accounts being compromised and so forth. So I think, there's a lot of education as a key role, but I think there also has to be education both around secure practices, but also what happens if your information is compromised. And I think a lot of work has to be done around and is starting to happen. Obviously, in the United States, we're pretty far behind. We don't even have basic EMV technology, so that is starting to shift right now in the marketplace. But I think over time, you're going to see a lot of these new technologies, not just with Apple Pay, of course. Tokenization can be done in many different ways. You're going to see these other things start to come into play, which will eventually increase consumer confidence. But every step you take that you make something more secure, obviously, there's other vulnerabilities that can still exist. Example, EMV technology is great at the point of sale, right? But it doesn't necessarily help you when you're online. You still have the same problems. And we've seen other countries shift into these new technologies, and the fraud moves from point of sale and moves to other points or moves around the globe. It basically moves to the weakest point. So I think the consumer education piece is going to be huge as well.
Bill, Jared, or Louis, any comments on this security question?
So just briefly, our Internet of Things report has a section on privacy. And so one of the best practices is really having companies implement a security by design approach. So tokenization might be an example of that. On our law enforcement side, in our Fandango and Credit Karma case, we brought action against 2 companies that had disabled default security measures to protect the financial information that. In our Credit Karma and Fandango cases, 2 companies basically disabled default settings that would have protected personal information of consumers, including Social Security and financial information. So that resulted in a settlement which required the 2 companies to build robust compliance programs, and there was significant recording requirements that are now in place. So those are just 2 examples.
Thank you. So, all right, let's go to another privacy question. And it was actually a couple of years after I got a smartphone before I started using any apps. And the reason is, as a lawyer, I actually read the permissions. And I said, I'm not doing it. I think the first one was curled my hair. Thank you, Kate. So the first one, which I still need, is the app that. Well, a study's been done that takes 30, the average person, if they read all their permissions and terms and conditions they click through without reading them, it would actually take 30 hours a day to do that based on average consumer behavior. So kind of the question is, can you really live in a modern, connected world like we live in with these computers on our hips or in our purses, not to mention our desktops, our cars, and our refrigerators? Can you really live in that kind of world and expect any privacy? Or is privacy just, at best, an illusion? Who wants to take first crack at that? Jared wants it. Jared, it's yours.
I'll start, but I think it's actually an excellent question for Bill.
You yield the floor.
I'll take it. No, I'll take it, and I'll give an homage to Doc. That's a legal asymmetry, right? And that's in place because information is power, right? And one side of the table has $700 an hour lawyers. We don't. And so if we just simply revisit these legal instruments so that the use of the data is contextually relevant and that it's a fair deal and the legalese is stripped out if it's knowingly understandable, yes, privacy can be an economic incentive. But right now, we're giving the leverage, if you will, to a hyper-concentrated set of actors in the marketplace who are designed to instrument us. So yeah, privacy is very possible. It can be very economically viable. And as 2.5 billion people connect to the online, I think there's also almost a moral obligation to revisit, can we make the demand side of the equation kind of legally cognizable as well as the supply side?
Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, let me just add that although I don't like clicking through those as anyone would, from the Bureau's perspective,
A little closer to Mike.
From the Bureau's perspective, those terms of agreement, those agreements are important for us in determining whether a company might be able to share information on consent on behalf of their employees. The things like even employment agreements that the day one of a job you sign and stick in a file and never see it again. All of those privacy agreements are important to us to enable us to do our job.
Jared, go ahead.
I just quickly add, even absent those disclosures, our agency has sort of discussed what should happen when there is significant amounts of data being collected, and our best practices has really been that data collection should really be consistent with the context of a consumer interaction. So if you're using your Google Maps feature on your phone to find where the Starbucks is, it makes sense that location's being collected. Context is important.
Louis, you want to keep going or audience time? Keep going? Okay. Are you implying the audience is asleep? All right. Yeah, let's keep going. So the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, is now going to broaden their privacy coverage. Was at a workshop on Tuesday at the FCC regarding, because they've, as you may, who's heard of net neutrality in here? Okay. It was in the news. So the FC, one of the consequences of that is that the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, may lose some jurisdiction over entities like Verizon, because carriers are now going to be regulated in providing broadband, and most of these transactions take place over broadband. So the FTC has an ongoing action against AT&T. Not clear whether they'll get to keep that. Meanwhile, the FCC is looking at Section 222 of the Communications Act, which is customer proprietary network information. And essentially what the battle is going to come down to, and it's going to be a big battle, is the FCC is going to look at putting privacy regulations on browsing history. And so AT&T was on the panel and vociferously arguing that that they should have the right to be able to continue to sell browsing history without being subject to new privacy regulations. And they have a good argument, which is, well, guess what? And this goes right back to my original hypothetical. Google isn't a carrier, so they're not subject to these new regulations. So this isn't fair. And it was pointed out that AT&T in a test market is offering consumers privacy of their browsing history for $30 a month. You can opt out of having your browsing history sold to their advertisers. So my final question before we go to the audience is, do consumers really care about privacy, or is it all about the money? If they can have their data be gathered and turned into big data and sold and save them $30 a month, is that what they'll do? Should they be allowed to do that? Is this a customer choice issue? Who wants to take first swing at that? David or Jared?
I'll take it. Yes, they care about their privacy. No, I mean.
Okay.
No, I mean.
Facebook lately?
Our the agency perspective has always been that notice and choice are important, and outside of the notice and choice framework, data collection should really happen in the context of the consumer transaction. So.
Well, these are tough questions. So, David? Yeah.
The only thing I would say is I think consumers are more willing to trade privacy when they see an actual benefit to them for it. I mean, there's certain things. There's a company, a startup that was acquired by Google for their maps purposes, an Israeli company that developed a great mapping app that basically uses your real-time data when you're in traffic and your traffic patterns and collects that and aggregates it to show people here's where the patterns and traffic tends to flare up when you're driving and those things. In that case, consumers, not everyone, of course, but a lot of people would find that useful, and they'd be willing to volunteer their data to be able to aggregate that in ways. And if it's conducted safely and properly and anonymized and so forth, I think people would be willing to make that trade-off. But if you're doing one random thing and they're using your cookies for other data for something else, probably not. So, but I think when presented clearly and not in legalese and explained in plain English, and the benefit is actually presented to people would be willing to make that trade-off.
All right. Leon's asked us to move into audience questions. So I think the first one was up here. Wait for the mic if you could.
Hi, Deb Baxley, Capgemini. I just thought it would be interesting to poll the audience among us who cares about their data, who is concerned about the privacy of their data online.
All right, no. Who does something about it?
How many of you use Tor?
Okay.
Tor.
Next one, second
Actual
row from the
privacy
back.
systems. Settings.
Good question.
Thank you.
When you see a startup that is making an effort to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act and other state licensing laws, but they're not yet fully compliant, what factors do you consider in determining whether or not to bring a case?
Is this for Jared? For Jared?
Anyone?
Well, bringing a case sounds like an FTC issue to me.
Not under the Bank Secrecy Act.
Pardon?
Not under the Bank Secrecy Act.
Okay. Oh, it's a bank secrecy.
So this is not my area, Treasury. I would have to get one of my colleagues in the TFI to speak to this. So I can't. But I mean, I think what they would say if I channel them would be that every case is individual. It depends. Obviously, if someone's trying to comply, that's a good thing. Versus trying to elude it. But
Thank you. Okay.
And I can just add that in working with the U.S. Attorney's Office for many years, it's a partnership and a collaborative process in determining how culpable bad actors are, how provable a case is, what the deterrent value is in the prosecution of one bad actor versus another. So it is hard to apply a strict formula. Intent is often an element of many of the statutes. I'm not as familiar with those financial crimes, but there is some prosecutorial discretion, and that's done collaboratively with the investigators.
Richard Field. I wonder, as a matter of public policy, what you would advise to a government, either the U.S. or another country, as to which is more important, an informed citizenry or a protected citizenry. Informed would mean possibly within the STEM curriculum in 8th grade, people have to learn what's inside the box, what is going on that we don't know yet, and be able to understand their own risks. A protected citizenry is relying on legislators to do something so you can wake up in the morning and not worry every step you take that you're getting screwed, basically, that somebody's got your back. Which is more important and more useful?
Can I, in all due respect, say it's a false dichotomy? You can't
Sure.
have either or.
Just do it in the mic.
Yeah, you can't have either or. Or if you do, I think you could see the type of political structures that you would get in either environment. So I would say where there's an imbalance is a critical literacy, not on the data. I think it'd be easier to count the carbon atoms in your body, but the intention of the usage of the data. I'm serious about the carbon thing too. So how do we understand what the intentions are of the algorithms? And there's great work being done over at the journalism school here at Columbia of who's behind it, what math is being used, what data isn't being included, and ultimately what are they trying to instrument? Those types of questions, I think, particularly at all multiple levels of society, are going to be increasingly important of what's the intended impact. Internet of Things, as the world has to be more predictive about who I am as I simply just walk down a street. Doors will open, cars will stop, all of these elements. I think that's going to be the literacy that we need to understand, and what's the intention versus what were the ingredients that rendered that outcome. And I think that's where, collectively as a generation, we're all still anchored in, if you will, the previous paradigm, where an application had a specific data set and it drove certain outcomes.
Do we have time for one more? Or we? Okay, one more. I think up here.
If I could just add one comment to that.
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
While the mic's going up, maybe.
I would just like to add one comment to that. I don't think it was directed necessarily at the
Oh, we got
FBI
5
or
minutes.
enforcement authorities, but it's important to note that we, within DOJ, spend a lot of time thinking about privacy. It may not be intuitive or well publicized, but we spend a significant amount of time thinking about how, and our mandate to conduct investigations using the least intrusive means possible. When you talk about the desire to have a protected citizenry, we get that. We're citizens too, and we're stakeholders in the country and value our privacy as much as others do. So there is a lot of internal discussion within the FBI in conducting both criminal and national security investigations regarding how they're going to be conducted and how carefully they should be conducted. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, I'm told we have 5 more minutes, so we'll take 2 more, you and then you. Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a software engineer. I'm curious, what is the most sort of compelling technology that will enable you to pursue your mandate? And I'm getting at is identity and digital identity one of the more important things for preventing crime online?
Maybe Jay?
Let me make sure I understand the question. What, Alec?
Sorry, I
Yes.
should rephrase it. So I'm kind of getting at what is the most compelling technology that sort of helps prevent crime online? Cybercrime, internationally, domestic. What is the most compelling technological field that is going to protect people?
Right. I think that would require a week to answer, but I think there is a responsive answer to that question that raises a significant point. For the last several years, the Bureau has undertaken an initiative to inform members of Congress and others within the U.S. government regarding the increasing gap between our ability to collect information lawfully, pursuant to process and otherwise appropriately, and the ability of providers to segregate only the information that we're looking for from the broader pool of data collected. And we refer to that as the going dark problem, because with the advent of technology, and it's constantly changing, we are dark at times on, even with a court order in hand, when information is presented, in other words, to a valid, neutral, detached judge, and we present sufficient information to warrant judicial process, serving that process is ineffective. The carrier or the provider can't segregate the data we're looking for out from others. And it's an issue that we're dealing with right now. In fact, 2 days ago, there was a hearing in front of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform regarding this problem. And based on the responses, and I'm going to have to double down on my disclaimer now, these represent my views, not the views of the FBI or DOJ, but in reading the transcript, I've heard members of Congress say, well, we're concerned about giving the FBI the golden key to information. I don't think that's an apt analogy. Or a backdoor to technology. If, to Jared's point about the design of technology being mindful of privacy and in some cases access for law enforcement, we've often heard about a backdoor in technology, and that's not the way we view our role. We view our role as waiting on the front door and knocking and presenting valid process for information. So we're going to have to work more closely with our colleagues, many of whom are on this panel and others, to present a more coordinated approach to some of those issues. But
All right,
that's
so
a good
one
question.
more quick question from Kate.
Hi, Kate Cronin. So in trying to find a middle ground between a highly regulated environment and consumers who really don't have enough time, even if they are educated, to read all the terms and conditions in a world that has a lot of disclosures, have any of your organizations contemplated the usefulness of a good housekeeping seal of approval? Something that facilitates good consumer decision-making to address different data privacy issues, in the world of mobile apps, mobile payment systems, and the coming Internet of Things. And what entities, disinterested entities, do you think would be good bodies to be adopting and driving those types of seals of approval?
Kate told me it was a good question. She was right. So quick answer from who wants to start? Bill? Jared?
I can offer one thing for further consideration on that, and it's not from my work, but it's from attendance at a different seminar where some technical folks were describing the Internet of Things, and it was alluded to here about your Nest thermostat or your smart TV having the ability to download content. And the point that was made that I think is relevant to your question is that hardware or manufacturers design the hardware to last many years, 7, 8, 10 years. But almost from the day it's issued, that smart TV and all the software and the operating system that runs that smart TV, at times there are hundreds of known vulnerabilities in that software. From the second it comes out of the box, and a consumer who's looking at price points and Best Buy isn't going to know, right? And even if you're vigilant and you go to the manufacturer's site and download updates, they stop supporting those updates within a year or so. So that expensive item that you're going to have in your house for 8 or 10 years, you're not going to have the ability to make it secure. So the point I was making is that what was offered was, and this wasn't my suggestion, but I found it interesting, something akin to a nutritional label on food, where it's in a standardized format on the box, where it describes what the operating system is, what the software is, how long updates are going to be provided. And that's not, I think, within my lane to comment further on, but it's an interesting idea for consumers to be able to compare apples to apples when making purchases. And ultimately, I think economics is going to drive that.
All right, so I don't want to eat into the next panel's time too much. So thank you very much. We've had a great panel. Bill, I started counting my carbon atoms. I ran out of fingers, so I'm going to go solve the privacy problem. It's much easier. Please thank our panel.
David, can you hear us?
Okay, thank you very much, Brooks, and the panel.